The court refused to open the prayers, not because they were poorly written, because the man who sent them no longer looked entirely human. The manuscripts had been copied by hand over the course of years by a former emperor living alone in exile on the island of Shikoku. They were prayers for the dead, for soldiers lost in a war he had failed to win. The room in Sanuki province was barely large enough to sleep in. Officials assigned to monitor him reportedly avoided remaining longer than necessary. One account describes the air as carrying the smell of wet ink, salt water, and something metallic. When the court finally returned, the sutras unopened, something inside him fractured beyond repair. Kyoto no longer feared Sutoku as a political rival. They feared him as something spiritually contaminated, irreversibly changed. He reaches into his mouth. He bites through the tip of his tongue. Witnesses claimed blood ran down his chin and onto the unfinished sutras. And with that blood, he wrote, "I shall become a great demon of Japan. I shall reverse emperor and subject. I shall send these sutras down the path of darkness." Afterward, accounts say he stopped cutting his hair, stopped washing, let his nails grow long and darken. Visitors who entered his room in those final months no longer described it as the room of a disgraced emperor. They described entering the room of something else entirely. They had a word for it: Tengu. By the end of this story, you'll understand why the Japanese court eventually built shrines not to honor Sutoku, but to calm him. Japan is a country of mountains. Historically, they were never considered empty. They were thresholds. In Heian, Japan, the deeper a person traveled into the forests surrounding Kyoto, the less human order seemed to hold. Rank faded, status faded, even religion became uncertain at the edges. The forests were not simply the opposite of civilization. They were older than it. And in Japanese belief, mountains were places where the boundary between the human world and the spirit world grew thin and unstable. Many ascetics intentionally entered these regions. Some fasted for weeks. Some pushed themselves to the threshold of death, searching for an enlightenment that existed beyond ordinary human experience. And in places where exhaustion, faith, fear, and absolute solitude overlap, stories begin to change shape. Then came the violence of 1156. One civil war shattered the illusion that imperial authority still governed Japan. Power no longer belonged to the throne. It belonged to whoever could survive a battlefield. Inside that fracture, two stories emerged. One belonged to an emperor who lost everything and refused to remain human. The other belonged to a child who entered a mountain alone and came back as something history has never been able to fully explain. In 1159, following the Heiji Rebellion, an infant boy named Ushiwaka, who would later become known as Minamoto no Yoshitsune, was sent to Mount Kurama. Around the age of 10, he was placed in the care of the monks there. After the Taira clan spared his life on a single condition: he would become a monk. A monk cannot seek revenge. According to legend, Ushiwaka began disappearing into the forest alone at night. No witnesses followed him. But years later, the monks began noticing changes they could not easily explain. Some reportedly refused to spar with him, not because he was stronger, because the way he watched them had become unsettling. Villagers spoke of hearing wooden swords striking together deep inside the forest long after the temple gates had closed for the night. The thing teaching him was Sojobo, the king of the Tengu. The legends held that Sojobo taught the boy movement that had no human rhythm, swordsmanship beyond ordinary technique, how to fight like something descending from the mountains themselves rather than moving through them. The historical Ushiwaka became Minamoto no Yoshitsune, one of the most celebrated military commanders in Japanese history. At the Battle of Ichi-no-Tani, Yoshitsune led warriors down a cliff face his enemies had judged impossible to descend. Contemporary accounts describe the attack less like military strategy and more like something falling out of the mountains. Over time, stories like these spread far beyond emperors and warriors into every village that sat beneath the tree line. Mountain villages developed their own relationship with the Tengu, not the grand figure of imperial legend, but something closer, something that waited at the edges of ordinary life. Travelers described hearing footsteps behind them along narrow forest paths. When they stopped walking, the footsteps stopped too. When they turned around, nothing was there. Then something creaked high above in the canopy. The footsteps had never been on the ground. Children in some villages were taught a single rule that required no explanation. If you hear movement in the mountains after dark, do not look upward. In one Edo period account, a hunter emerged from the forest unable to explain where several hours of his memory had gone. He remembered hearing branches moving overhead, then nothing. When he finally found the path again, an entire day had passed. The stories repeated themselves across generations, across regions, always arriving at the same central feeling. Something intelligent was watching from above the tree line, not hunting, waiting for people to notice it, waiting for them to look up. This is what separated the village Tengu from the theological one. It wasn't a metaphor in these stories. It was a presence, something that could still be encountered if you wandered far enough into the wrong part of the mountain at the wrong hour. And that possibility, that encounter, was precisely what kept the stories alive. But the villages were only the surface. The deeper story, the one the monks tried to bury, was written in a different kind of blood. It didn't live in the mountains, it lived in a throne room, and it started with a man who refused to be forgotten. While Ushiwaka trained in the mountains, the exiled Emperor Sutoku continued to deteriorate in Sanuki province. When he died in 1164, accounts claimed his body did not decompose for 20 days. When he was finally cremated, storms reportedly gathered over the funeral grounds, and the stones surrounding the casket were found stained dark with moisture no one could account for. For centuries afterward, disasters in Kyoto were traced back to his restless spirit. Political assassinations, fires, military failures. Shrines were eventually constructed, but not to worship him, to calm him. That distinction carried everything. The word itself, Tengu, appears first in the Nihon Shoki, compiled in 720 CE, where a Buddhist priest identified a large shooting star as a heavenly dog, recording the event as occurring around 642 CE. At that moment, it was simply an atmospheric phenomenon given a name. But over the following centuries, the creature slowly transformed. Early depictions showed bird-like mountain spirits with wings, claws, and hawk-sharp beaks. Later versions became increasingly human. Red-faced ascetics with impossibly elongated noses, dressed like wandering monks who had been in the mountains too long. Some were believed to abduct priests, others punished arrogance. Others passed hidden martial knowledge to warriors deemed worthy. But beneath every version, the same disturbing idea persisted. The The Tengu was never entirely separate from humanity, and from that recognition emerged the concept that gave the mythology its sharpest edge: Tengudo, the Tengu Road. A spiritual path reserved for those who could not descend into hell because of their devotion, yet could not rise into enlightenment because of their pride. They existed in the space between, neither divine, neither damned, neither human any longer. The face remained recognizable, almost human, because the Tengu did not begin as a creature. It began as a person, one who had climbed so far in status, in faith, in certainty, in ego, that they could no longer find their way back down to ordinary life. The Tengu was not born, it is arrived at. By the 13th century, certain Buddhist institutions had accumulated significant political influence and considerable wealth. The gap between religious teaching and institutional behavior had grown impossible to ignore. And rather than deny the corruption, artists turned it into monsters. The 7 Tengu scrolls depict high-ranking monks with the sharp beaks and predatory faces of Tengu demons. The robes are correct, the rank is evident, but the faces have changed. The message required no explanation. Pride had transformed them, not physically, spiritually. The Tengu became a visual language for what happens when certainty calcifies into superiority. When religious authority convinces itself it exists beyond criticism. Even today, the phrase persists in ordinary Japanese: Tengu ni naru. To become a Tengu, it refers to someone consumed by arrogance, self-importance so complete it has reshaped how they move through the world. Because arrogance changes the shape of a person long before it changes their face. Today, hikers still walk the paths of Mount Kurama. But deeper into the mountain, something in the atmosphere shifts. The cedar roots rise from the earth like old bones. Sound travels strangely between the trees, and the silence gradually stops feeling empty. The stories survived because mountains preserve memory differently than cities do. Empires collapse, dynasties disappear, languages drift until the words no longer mean what they once meant. But forests remain, watching generations pass beneath them, accumulating everything. Somewhere inside those mountains, history and folklore became tangled together so completely that separating them stopped feeling possible, and perhaps stopped mattering. And perhaps that is why the Tengu endured across 12 centuries, through every political upheaval and religious reformation that reshaped Japanese culture. Because the most frightening possibility was never that demons existed in the mountains. It was that human beings could become them, not through a curse, not through violence, but through the slow, quiet accumulation of pride, one step at a time, upward, away from everyone else. The Tengu was not born, it is arrived at, and the mountain is always closer than you think. If these stories find you, subscribe. There are darker corners still. And next, we go to Canada, 1988, a commune hidden in the woods. Children vanished into silence, and the one man who made them call him father, while the world outside never thought to look.